I'm gonna try and get some good shots, so make sure y'all get me some promo pictures in there.
There is so much good stuff on Netflix these days, to the point that it is often hard to pick out particularly good content to check out. That being said, a lot of you have seemingly already found a great docu-series on there. Specifically, Tiger King: Murder, Mayhem, and Madness. And with all of the insanity that the series puts in front of the camera, there's even more craziness that we didn't see, or that was only lightly touched upon by the documentary film crew. Luckily, that's where I come in, bringing you the facts, covering little details that you might have missed about the series. However, it should be noted that while I talk about these things, I am going to be spoiling the snot out of the series. So if you have any interest at all in watching it, go do that right now. With that out of the way, let's dive right into talking about this.
You're muddy, my sexy tiger.
So there has been a pretty serious update since the series was done filming. Despite being behind bars for the next 2 decades or so, Joseph Maldonado Passage, also known as Joe Exotic, has officially filed a lawsuit against his former partner, Jeff Lowe. In addition to the United States Department of the Interior, the U.S. Federal Wildlife Service, and some of the people that we see in the series. Basically, he is suing for perjury, false imprisonment, violating his civil rights, a lot of stuff like that. Basically, everything that he says at the end of the series, that's what he's suing about. He believes that federal agents and all of the people named in the suit specifically targeted him and ignored the truth to get him and only him put behind bars. Now, one thing that the series doesn't touch upon really is how exactly a man like Joe Exotic can come into possession of an entire menagerie of tigers. Like, how exactly does one buy a zoo? During the 1990s, Exotic purchased a horse farm near Wynnewood, Oklahoma. After a while, he came into possession of his first big cats and converted the farm into the GW Zoo. And in those early years, Exotic used the horses that he originally had and any that were donated to his facility to feed the big cats, which were probably a bit tastier than some expired Walmart meat. The series does spend quite a bit of time talking about Joe Exotic's political aspirations, but one thing that it doesn't really talk about is just exactly how many votes he managed to pull in. Spoiler alert, it wasn't very many. Let's start off with his presidential campaign back in 2016, where Exotic ran as an independent and was able to get on the ballot in Colorado, of all places. Of the over 118 million votes that were cast in the 2016 election, Joe Exotic managed to pull in a whopping 962 votes, including write-ins. That's not a lot. And as far as the governor's race in 2018, well, that one was a little bit better ratio-wise, but it was still only 664 total votes. So yeah, maybe not the best career path for Exotic to try to go down. You know what else might not have been a great career move for Joe Exotic? Becoming a country music artist. Actually, that at least made him money as opposed to costing him money like the political aspirations. But you've gotta wonder if he actually wrote and performed the songs himself. Well, reportedly, Exotic lip syncs to someone else's voice, only really playing the part of a country music star, which wouldn't really surprise me, to be honest. Now let's take a little bit of a break from talking about Exotic and instead talk about the people around him. Starting with his former producer and the guy who was trying to get the Tiger King reality show off the ground in the first place, Rick Kirkham. Kirkham was a reporter for the show Inside Edition, but during that time, he also had a rather dark secret, as he had an extremely serious problem with drugs. This secret became the focus of a documentary entitled TV Junkie, which included video diary footage from when Kirkham was 14 up to the present day. Sadly, the documentary wasn't super well received, but if you're interested in checking it out, it might actually be worth your while. Okay, let's shift over to the man that took over the GW Zoo and gave Joe Exotic the boot. I'm talking about Jeff Lowe, the businessman with a bad side. Now, the series does spend a little bit of time talking about Lowe's past run-ins with the law, but it doesn't quite cover exactly how bad some of his legal troubles have been. We hear in the series that he beat and strangled his ex-wife, but he has also been brought up on charges several times of using animals for profit, without proper permits and licensing, operating pay-to-play businesses and such without proper authorization. So yeah, he doesn't really seem to be all too friendly to either people or animals. After watching Tiger King, you might be sitting there thinking to yourself, man, seeing tigers in Oklahoma is pretty crazy. That's something you'll never see where I live. Well, don't be so sure, since big cats are actually more common in the United States than you would think. According to the World Wildlife Fund, there are roughly 5,000 tigers living in the United States, with only about 6% of them living within zoos and other such facilities that are accredited by the Association of Zoos and Aquariums. The other 94% are either living in private collections or unaccredited facilities. So there is a chance that one of your neighbors could possibly have a tiger. But do you know where there actually aren't a lot of big cats? Out in the wild, you know, where the animals belong. According to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, there are only between 3,200 and 3,500 tigers currently living in the wild across the globe. That's not exactly a lot, especially when compared to the number of cats living in captivity around the world. There are actually more big cats in cages than out in the open, and that's a pretty tough pill to swallow if you really stop and think about it. One thing that gets mentioned a few times throughout the series is the Endangered Species Act. But what is it exactly? Passed in 1973, this is actually an act of Congress that was designed to protect animal species that were at the highest risk of becoming extinct due to the actions of human beings. Basically, it aims to stop us from completely wiping out a handful of specific species. And it also tries to help those species recover their numbers to the point that they no longer need to be protected by the act, which is a good way to go when you really think about it. In addition to the Endangered Species Act, there is also another act that is talked about during the series that is meant to help protect the animals, that being the Big Cat Public Safety Act. This act, known officially as H.R. 1380, was put before Congress back in 2019 and was meant to amend the Lacey Act in order to help protect more specific types of animals, namely big cats. Now wait a second, what the heck is the Lacey Act? Well, the Lacey Act is a law that was passed back in 1900 that was designed to help conservation efforts by prohibiting the trade of wildlife, fish, and plants that had been acquired illegally in some way. I'm sure that pretty much everyone watching this video has at least heard of the organization known as People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, also known as PETA. But what does the group actually do? Founded back in March of 1980 by a pair of animal rights activists, PETA seeks to eliminate the abuse of animals in any way, such as being used for clothing, food, research, and even entertainment. So yeah, it's understandable why they would not be big fans of Joe Exotic. While PETA has a fairly noble goal, they have been the focus of quite a bit of controversy, even within the world of animal rights activists. Some people say that the organization goes too far, with their demonstrating and some of the other less than savory things that they have done, while others argue that they just don't go far enough. Either way, PETA has at the very least done a lot to raise awareness for the cause of animal rights, and love them or hate them, they aren't going anywhere anytime soon. Murder for hire, or contract killing as it is often referred to as, is something that happens pretty much all the time in the movies. But how common is it in reality? Now, while we don't have any official numbers, what we have does give us somewhat of a look at the realities of this specific type of crime. In Australia, it is reported that between 1989 and 2002, there were about 162 attempted or successful contract killings, which accounted for about 2% of the total number of homicides during that period. So okay, not super common, but what about the cost? Once again, in Australia, a study was done that found that the average cost of a hit was around $15,000. So yeah, $3,000 isn't exactly a lot of money in regards to this kind of job. Another thing that we see all the time in the movies, and actually see happen in the Tiger King docu-series, is someone working with the feds and becoming a confidential informant. Kinda makes me wonder though, what exactly does being an informant entail? Well, in reality, an informant is someone who usually either is contacted by law enforcement officials directly, or who comes forward themselves and provides information to said law enforcement agencies. Now, they aren't always undercover or confidential, like we see in Tiger King. Sometimes the individuals simply provide information and then go about their merry way. Others, though, are used in sting operations, wearing a wire like we see in movies and such. So them using one during the investigation into Joe Exotic isn't all too surprising, all things considered. One thing that you might have found surprising is the fact that the US Federal Wildlife Service took part in the investigation. Sure, the FBI being involved in a murder-for-hire scheme makes sense. That's what we all expect. But the Wildlife Service? Well, the fact of the matter is that the United States Wildlife Service becomes involved whenever animals are concerned. Not to mention the fact that the Wildlife Service is specifically tasked with enforcing any laws involving animals and plants, such as enforcing the Endangered Species Act. So all in all, them being there isn't really surprising in the slightest when you think about it. One thing that the series talks about quite a bit in the middle is the disappearance of Carol Baskin's late husband, Don Lewis. Now, I'm not going to get into the accusations against Baskin, as that could be the subject of an entire video all on its own. Instead, let's talk about the process surrounding a missing persons investigation, since we constantly hear about them in the media, but I don't think we ever really hear about what actually goes into them exactly. Basically, once someone is reported missing, the clock begins. One of the first things that law enforcement officials try to do is secure any possible evidence and interviews that they can within the first 48 hours, as after that, people's memory starts to fade a little bit, and as time goes on, leads become harder and harder to follow up on. One thing that sometimes causes people to go missing, and the reason that Carol Baskin argued might be the case with her late husband, is dementia, or more specifically, Alzheimer's. So what exactly are those? Well, according to the Alzheimer's Association, dementia is the broad term used to describe any disease or condition that is characterized by a decline in one's ability to recall memories, solve problems, speak, or really be able to utilize any thinking skills necessary to perform everyday tasks. These changes can often impair a person's ability to think straight, which can lead to them just sort of wandering off. Let's get away from the heavy stuff for a second and talk about some of the more entertaining aspects that we see in the series. A couple of different times throughout the series, we see some footage from Joe Exotic's web show, showing him firing off some guns and somehow blowing up a bunch of different stuff. What he is using to do that is a substance known as Tannerite. Tannerite, if you're not aware, is a type of explosive that can actually be bought in certain locations across the United States. Different states do have different laws regarding it, obviously, but it can be done. The reason this is the case is largely twofold. For starters, it comes in two different components, so you need to mix it yourself. Secondly, it will not detonate on its own, and instead requires to be shot by a high velocity round to go boom. Besides being something that is just meant to be fun, Tannerite is actually meant for a couple of different purposes. First is target marking. Alternatively, it is also used for commercial purposes, such as low-level blasting and special effects. Something that we hear about a few times later on in the series is how much Joe Exotic talks about selling a few big cats for, saying that he could get about $5,000 per cat. Does that seem a little bit low to anybody else? Well, that's actually not too cheap, all things considered, as it is reported that you can actually get a hold of a tiger for as cheap as $800 to $2,000. The real kicker here, though, is the cost of caring for and maintaining these big felines. And that's before we even really get into the cost of simply feeding one of the kitties. So, okay, how much can a tiger really eat? Well, I hope you're sitting down for this one, as an average full-grown tiger requires roughly 5,000 to 6,000 kcals per day, which equals out to about 10 to 15 pounds of meat. That's per cat. And considering that tigers can live for up to 20 years, that's a heck of a cost. Now that I have thoroughly crushed your hopes and dreams of being able to afford your own pet tiger, perhaps you would instead want to help with conservation efforts. You know, help save the kitties. Well, for starters, you can always check out the World Wildlife Fund, which can be found at worldwildlife.org. There's also the Wildlife Conservation Society, which can be found at wcs.org. Honestly, there are a lot of different organizations out there that seek to aid in protecting tigers and other such big cat species. Just be sure to do your own research on each organization before donating, so that way you can be certain of where exactly your money is going. Did you watch Tiger King? Did you catch any details that we didn't talk about? Let us know your thoughts down in the comments below. And while you're down there, why not consider subscribing to ScreenRant for more awesome videos just like this. Thanks for watching, and stay safe out there.